Let's hear it.
So I'm going to do that because I really don't want people to miss this.
Yeah.
So
you want me to back up for 2 seconds?
yeah, could you do that?
Okay. All right. So everybody who was multitasking, you get another run at this. I'll say it again. And Dan, thank you for that. I'm glad that you liked the reframe. And Debbie, thank you for, I'm glad that you've joined us on the LinkedIn Lives. Those were a lot of fun. Okay, let me back up. I will recap for you very quickly. So some of you are familiar with the S curve. It's been around for decades. If you're in product, if you're in engineering, you're going to be familiar with this. Popularized by Everett Rogers, a sociologist, back in the 1960s. And he used it to figure out how quickly innovations would be adopted, basically how groups change over time. And then we used it at our Disruptive Innovation Fund that I co-founded with Clayton Christensen to look at or use it in our investment decisions. Is it going to be adopted quickly? Is it going to be adopted slowly? Where is it on that adoption or diffusion curve? And then make the investment decisions accordingly. Well, what happened for me is because I'd already had this in my mind of, okay, companies don't disrupt, people do, that there's this thing called personal disruption. It wasn't too much of a leap for me to say, how does this apply to the individual? And the aha I had, the insight that I had is that we could use the S curve to understand how we learn and how we grow. And so let me talk you through at a very high level how you can use this to think about your own growth. Our brains, they run these predictive models. And whenever you start something new, you make a lot of predictions about what is it going to take for me to move from the bottom of this S curve to the top of the S curve. Well, at the launch point of the curve, many of your predictions that you're making are inaccurate. And so you have the dopamine, which is the chemical messenger of delight. It basically de-delights. Your dopamine is dropping. The other experience that you're having at the launch point of the curve is you're mapping new territory, thinking about this as a mountain. And as you're mapping that new territory, it is cognitively taxing and it is emotionally taxing. So if you come home from work or which is sometimes in the different room in the house, but you finish up work for the day and you've just started a new role or a new project and you feel exhausted, well, of course you are. It's been very, very taxing. The other thing that happens for you at the launch point is that you're having this experience of you're no longer who you were, but you're not yet who you're going to be. And so there's this big identity shift that's happening. It feels in flux. And so that can be very discombobulating for us. And so the experience, the emotional experience that you have at the launch point of the curve is, while it is thrilling, it can also feel terrifying, overwhelming, discouraging. You can feel impatient. And it's not that growth isn't happening, but because of all that I just described, the experience that you have is that it feels very slow. And so that's the emotional aspect of growth.
Do you think that people know they're in that space a lot of the time, or is it something you sort of discover that you're in?
Well, that's part of why I love this model so much, because I think that we are in that place, but we don't often have a way to describe it. And so because we're feeling so uncomfortable and gangly and awkward, we can misinterpret the fact that we're at the launch point of the curve with, oh, I'm not good at this and I will never be good at this. It is true you may never be good at it, but it's important to disentangle the two and say to yourself, all right now I'm at the launch point of this curve. It may not be a curve that I want to stay on, but I want to be really clear with myself that when I'm doing something new, I am not going to do it well. And you can use this to talk yourself through all sorts of situations. You can use this, basically, like I said, all sorts of situations. So, that's what you need to disentangle. And there are ways to do that. But that's the thing you want to think about is it is a situation normal when you feel uncomfortable and awkward and maybe even like an imposter at the launch point. Okay. Shall I go to the sweet spot?
Yes.
Okay, so here's what happens in the sweet spot. You are starting to you're continuing to make predictions, and those predictions are becoming increasingly accurate. And because they're becoming increasingly accurate, you're getting a lot of dopamine. They're basically emotional upside surprises. And this is part of the reason why in the stock market, when you beat estimates, stocks go up, because people have just had this emotional upside surprise and they think there's going to be a lot more upside. And so that feels exhilarating. The second thing that's happening is you're mapping the territory, not completely mapped, but you have a clearer sense. You still have to be deliberate, but it's not quite as exhausting. And same with your identity, not yet who you'll be, but it's starting, the picture is starting to become clear. And so, or clearer, I should say. And so what's happening here is that growth is fast. You're putting in a little effort and a lot is happening. And so growth not only is fast, it feels fast. And the experience that you're having here is you're not only exhilarated, but you feel like you're exactly where you're supposed to be. You feel in flow. You feel like, I know what I'm doing. I've got this.
But then at some point you have to move out of that sweet spot.
Yes.
That sounds sad.
Yes, well, and it's a really great point, because you do want to extend the sweet spot as long as you possibly can. And certainly with relationships, you do the relationships that matter, family, friends that are really important to you, cats, like your cats, Merlin and Nero, you want to stay in the sweet spot as long as possible. But there are some situations, certain projects that you've worked on, even some relationships that you've had where you get into mastery. And what's happening here is that your dopamine, because the predictive model, you basically figured it out, you're getting a little bit of dopamine, but not a lot. You've mapped out the territory. So you sort of say, there's not a lot new for me to see here. And because there's not a lot new, and the identity transformation is complete, so that's a good thing. But because the dopamine's sort of flat, you can have this experience. Whereas at the launch point, you thought, wow, this is really hard to start this. In the sweet spot, you're like, oh yeah, momentum is taking over. Well, in mastery, you can have that experience of, I know I'm really good at this. Like, I'm really good at this, but I can't keep doing this anymore. And the reason that you feel that way is that you're not getting that dopamine in your brain and your neuroscience, your neurochemistry, and every part of you is saying, I can feel that there is something more. I need to do something more. I have to figure out a way to either keep climbing on this or find a new curve to jump to. And so you've got slow at the launch point, you have fast in the sweet spot, you have slow and mastery. This simple visual model allows you to trace the emotional arc of your growth. And once you understand what that looks like, then you increase your capacity to grow, because you've got a map to think about your growth.
So is the mastery spot kind of like your comfort zone then?
Yes, it is. And so part of what I find fascinating about this, if you go back to Clayton's work, he talked all the time about the innovator's dilemma. Well, you have a dilemma when you're in mastery, because there's two competing things happening. On the one hand, you have, if you think about neural pathways, right? When you're in mastery, what's happening from a neural pathway perspective? You are on a super highway of habits. Like, you just got it. Like those tracks, they are laid and you can just whiz past that. That's why there's nothing new to see. So that's really comfortable. You don't have to wake up in the morning and figure out, okay, I get the toothbrush and put my toothpaste on it. You just wake up and you do it subconsciously, you do it automatically. And there's a piece of you that really likes that. And your brain says, this is easy. You don't have to think at all. You don't have to work at all. Very, very low maintenance. At the same time, doing something new is more like a cow path. And on cow paths, you go very, very slowly. That's going to be a lot of work. It's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be awkward. And yet, there is something in our brains. Our brains are wired to grow. And so if we don't grow, if we don't acquire some stress, our brains, the neural pathways, they literally start to die. And so you now have this place of, yes, I got to the top of a mountain. And we know mountain climbers, any altitude above 26,000 feet is known as the death zone. Same thing happens for you. If you stay at the top of that curve too long, your brain and your body will literally start to die. So yep, it's comfortable, but if you're not growing, you're dying. And so that's where the dilemma comes in. I want to be comfortable, but if I stay comfortable too long, I'm probably better off if I disrupt myself, because if I don't, I'll get disrupted. And as I said, growth is our default setting. So here's a mechanism so that you can take charge of your growth.
So at the beginning of the book, you actually tell a story about this. You pull up Dear Abby, who famous advice column. Is just Abby still around? Like,
I don't think so, but I don't know for sure.
I
I
think
don't
it
think so.
might not be the same if it is, but
Mhm.
for those of you who remember, Dear Abby was a really famous advice column. Every newspaper ran it. And you tell this story about this 56-year-old man who had everything he worked for, but he just didn't have that spark to move forward.
Mhm.
And so he's in that comfort zone and what we're talking about, but he's not happy. And so he's mastered it. He's done everything he needs to have, but he's not happy. And so the idea of a comfort zone, you say, is actually the bane of growth, right?
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And so if you believe that growth is your default setting, which I do, that our brains are wired to grow, if someone says, I'm comfortable, there's nothing else left for me to do, then the question becomes, if we're actually wired for growth, then why do they believe that there's nothing left to do? There's something else going on. And that's that opportunity, I would argue, for personal work, for that inner work, for figuring out, well, why do I believe that there's nothing left to do? I mean, perhaps people have turned in on themselves, but if you think about this idea of moving to the top of a mountain, so think of that S curve as the top of the mountain. At the top of that curve, if you feel like there's nothing for you to do in terms of growing, think about, what do those S curve loops look like? It's a lot harder to go down and bring other people along that curve. And I love this quote from Tom Rath where he says, contribution is the sum of what grows when you're gone. And so if you feel like, okay, I've grown for myself, then what's your legacy going to be? How are you going to help other people grow, not just in life, but in this particular role? But again, more to from a sort of surgical standpoint, if you find people saying, there's nothing left for me to do, what I would say is everyone's on an S curve, including you. And so do a little bit of inner work, do some dissecting and try to understand, where is that coming from? And oftentimes when we say that, there's a fear, there's a belief that you won't be able to accomplish what you want to accomplish. And so people are stagnating. And so it's an opportunity for it, actually, that statement itself becomes an opportunity to not only for yourself to grow, but to help someone around you who might be saying that to grow as well.
So one of the questions that just came in was the idea that, would you say then that people who are in the field of technology, like Mark Zuckerberg, would eventually disrupt and move into something else, like the metaverse? And how Jeff Bezos has moved into space exploration. I mean, he
Right.
started with books, right? So,
Yeah, right.
um,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think if you look at Jeff Bezos, you say, and actually everybody who's listening, what I would encourage you to do, and you're probably already done this, is you're recognizing is that your life is an S curve, right? If you want to, think about this in fractals, your life is an S curve. But then you're also thinking about your career is a series of S curves, and you can start to map out, there was this S curve and I got to the top, and then I disrupted myself because I was at the top. And when I say at the top of a curve, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are the world's foremost expert in X, Y, or Z. It might be, I wanted to learn to play 5 songs on the ukulele, and I've done that. So now I want to learn to play 5 songs on the trombone, whatever it is. But to your question about Jeff Bezos, what we're looking at and articulating it in S curve language is that he got to the top of an S curve. He figured it out. He said, okay, I've got this. I've got this dialed in. I understand it well enough that now I'm going to delegate it to other people for whom this will be a new S curve for them, while I go figure out how to jump to new S curves. And so he's just continually thinking about this escalator. It becomes this way to think about continuous growth and development, of continually moving to the next S curve.
so one of the things that I really loved about the book was that you talk about the importance of figuring out what your why is. And so for me, my why is that of a storyteller. It's why I write novels. It's why I teach, and why I love this conversation, because I'm hearing all of these stories. And so for that first half of my life, I had the same thing that you describe in the book, this nagging feeling that I really should pursue that avenue more specifically. But I didn't ever think, for example, that I could write a full-length book. I just didn't think that it would be something that would ever prove fruitful for me. And so I'm way beyond that now. I know I can write. It's the one like power I feel like I have. But I remember what that was like and how hard it was to move forward and to believe that I was good enough to do that. And I'd love to know what advice you would give to somebody who really doesn't know how to get out of their own way or how to jump out of that comfort zone and basically become somebody who can disrupt their lives.
Oh, I love that question. All right. So first of all, yes, everybody, I read Feast of Sorrows, or I'm reading it, I should say. I haven't finished it, but she is a really good writer. So she jumped to this new S curve. So note to everybody. All right. So a few thoughts for you. So let's start with you're at the top of an S curve and you're thinking, So what I would say to you, first of all, is some of the ways that you know that you're at the top of an S curve are as follows. One is you, just from a time standpoint, if you've been in a role for a very long time, that may be an indicator. But if you're really enjoying your work, then you're probably still in the sweet spot. But if you find yourself saying things like, that's not how we do it here, or we've already tried that, and here's all the things that won't work, you find yourself not excited for people coming up behind you. In fact, you're feeling threatened by them and even perhaps a bit envious. That's a signal to you that you want to be growing, but you're not quite growing. But to your point, Crystal, I think the most important piece is there is this sense that while the work that you are doing is accomplishing the functional jobs that you needed to do, like putting food on the table, there is an emotional job that is being left undone. And again, back to the pandemic, I think we got a lot of schooling over the past 2 years in emotional, attending to the going to this school of emotional experience. And I think that's a real value. So if you have that feeling of, I feel like there's something more, or I'm really good at this and I can no longer keep doing it, these are all signals to you that you either need to do a new curve or you need to find a way to keep climbing on the S curve that you're on. Now, how do you motivate yourself to jump? Well, first of all, just understanding that this is part of the process of growth will help. Another thing that you can do is to recognize, and this builds on the work of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, which is the loss aversion theory, is that sometimes thinking about doing something new isn't enough to motivate us because it's just too frightening to do something new. And so when I know that I need to do something new, but I'm not super motivated yet by all the wonderful things that will happen if I do that new thing, I motivate myself by saying, what bad thing will happen to me if I don't? And it might be as simple as, okay, if I don't prepare to talk to you today on this webinar, I'm not going to feel comfortable and that's going to feel awful to me. It might be if I don't find a way to disrupt myself, I'm going to stagnate. And so this plateau that I'm on will become a precipice and I will get fired. So I probably need to figure out a way to stay engaged. So those are all some things that you can do to think about jumping to a new curve. Now, if you're still just thinking about it, that's okay. The other thing that you can do is start to use this idea of visualization to prime your brain. Just starting getting pictures of things that you think you might want to do, because what will happen is it will start to prime your brain. We've got this wonderful, magnificent filtering mechanism that will allow your brain to start seeing yourself doing that thing. Now, I have one other suggestion. I want to tell you a story that will capture this idea of doing something new that I think is so powerful. Sometimes you want to do something new and you believe that you can do it. Well, you don't quite believe that you can do it, but you believe that you can do it. Now, there are all sorts of things that you're never going to believe that you can do, but there are some things that you believe that you can do it. And that's enough. And let me tell you this story. So Marcus Whitney, he went to college at the University of Virginia, but he dropped out because he decided that he liked rap and weed more. So now he's a college dropout. He has 2 young children and he is living in an efficiency motel, which is basically living week to week. So a wife and 2 young children. And he's a server at a restaurant working 12 hours a day. And he's saying, here's a guy, he got into the University of Virginia, which is a great school. So he's capable and he's competent and he's living week to week. And he says, I've got to do something. Well, when he was 10 years old, his uncle Otis, which is the best name ever, worked at IBM and gave him a computer. And he learned a little bit of programming, but he hadn't really done much with it for about 10, 12 years. But he thought, I think maybe I could become a programmer. So he starts studying computer programming. He works 12 hours a day. He spends 4 or 5 hours at night trying to figure out how to become a programmer, and really wants to do this. But he says that there wasn't a lot of evidence that he could do it. He's a server. He's waiting tables. And by the way, he's a Black man. So if you're typecasting, you're not going to typecast him to become a programmer. And then he says something that this is going to this idea of he believed that he could believe. What happened for him is he didn't say to himself, I'm becoming a programmer. He said, I am a programmer. And those words are so powerful because your brain doesn't know, your subconscious doesn't know the difference between a truth and a lie. And so when you use the words I am, you're also, if you understand the Christian tradition, the Judeo-Christian tradition, I am, those words evoke a creative power. So when you say I am, and by the way, if any of you are thinking, oh yeah, whatever, I don't believe it, think about this for 2 seconds. Anybody you love has ever said to you, I am dumb or I am ugly. How do you feel? It just feels like a sword to the gut when you hear people that you love say that. So what that means is they have power. I am smart and I am beautiful. I am, and I am handsome. Okay. Because men don't usually say beautiful. I am a programmer. So he believed that he could believe. So if there's an S curve that you're thinking that you want to jump to, think about visualization. Start saying I am. And I really promised you this. You won't say I am about something that isn't actually a possibility. You won't want to. Like, I won't say I am an astronaut because that's really not a possibility for me at this stage of my life. But anything that is actually a possibility, you will be able to say, I am a programmer. So he believed that. So here's what's happened. Here's the rest of the story. He became a programmer. He did a barter. His wife was about to have a baby. And so he bartered they needed a midwife. She needed a programmer for his website. So he did that. He then becomes like an early employee at a company called Emma Email Marketing. That company gets sold 2 exits later, or he becomes the CTO of this company. 2 exits later, he now runs or is a co-owner of the Nashville professional soccer team in Nashville, Tennessee, for those of you who aren't in the United States, and runs a venture firm for healthcare, to fund Black-owned healthcare companies. And so all because he said, I am a programmer. So that's what I spent a lot of time on this, but it's just so important. Do you believe that you can do something? That is all it takes for you to jump to a new S curve and make it start to happen.
Well, I completely believe that because that's how my S curve began. It was like, I was like thinking to myself, I don't want to be a writer. I am a writer. I've always been one. I just have to do something with it. So
I just got chills. I love that.
Yeah.
I love
that.
You
were making me tear up as you're talking about it. So
I hope everybody is thinking about this idea of I am. What do you want to say that you are? I am a writer, I'm a speaker, I'm a programmer. What is it? I love it. Oh
yeah. So Dan Moyle also asked, and I think this kind of comes along with this idea, like, how important is setting regular protected aside time for personal and professional growth versus simply finding time to grow when we feel inspired? And I know for me, one of the things that had made a huge difference in my S curve was when I decided I want to do something with this writing thing that I am. And I set aside time every single morning to write before I do my work with HubSpot, which I love.
Right.
But I know that I personally found that I had to protect that time. What do you think about?
Oh, yeah. 100,000%. That's not actually a percent, but okay. So think about it. If we're going from super highway of habit to cow path, what is your brain going to want to do? Because our brains are lazy, and that's actually a good thing in many ways. Your brain is going to take the super highway every single nanosecond of every single day. And so setting aside time to do that cow path. That's why you want to, depending on when your energy is highest, and for most of the population, it's early in the day. You want to do something that is going to be very, very, do it every day. And I'm all about, whether it's ridiculously small goals, whether it's streaking, this idea of winning streaks. If you want to start something new, you want to make it so small that you'll do it no matter what, every single day. So I'll give you a simple example. I, during the pandemic, became a big fan of K-dramas, Korean dramas. They're so much fun. They're such great stories. Speaking of great storytelling. And so I thought it'd be fun to learn a little bit of Korean. And I didn't decide, oh, I'm going to take a Korean class, or I'm going to go to Korea, or I didn't do any of that. I just downloaded the Duolingo app, which, by the way, Pimsleur is better than Duolingo, but that's okay.
I would agree with that.
Downloaded the Duolingo app, and I said, I'm going to do like 2 minutes a day. Well, guess what? I had a streak up. I just finished it, a streak of 200 days.
Oh, wow.
This is how you know that you can do it every day. You make it so small so that even if it's 11 o'clock at night and you're just exhausted and you want to go to bed, you go, oh, I forgot. Okay, you'll still do it because it's so small, you can still do it. And then what will happen is to build on this Duolingo thing, I did that for 200 days and realized I'm not making the progress that I wanted to. Now I've moved to Pimsleur, but now it's becoming a habit. It's something that I do every day. So back to your question, Dan, for anything that's new, that cow path, that new S curve, it doesn't have to be a big thing. You just have to do a little thing every single day. So you start to build those tracks, and it starts to allow that little teeny keyhole of a space for that identity shift to happen. And that is how you turn that cow path over time into a superhighway.
And you're also building all those neurological pathways too,
Right.
which
That's right.
stave off, like, hopefully dementia and things.
Yeah.
Like
Oh, yes. Yeah. Then there are the health benefits. But see, then what's happening too, Crystal, as you just said that, is that as you build those pathways, your I am this, that actually identity becomes true, because every single day you are writing. So you are a writer. And so and let's go back to dopamine for just a second, because this is important. So what did I say at the launch point of the curve? What did I say? Dopamine was dropping and the sweet spot, it's spiking. So these idea of doing these little mini streaks, it's basically a hack, because every time you beat expectations, your dopamine spikes. So if you have something very, very small at the launch point that you could do every day, like my goal is a minute of Duolingo every day. Well, if I do a minute and 30 seconds every single day, I get dopamine. So all of a sudden I'm getting all this dopamine, even though I'm at the launch point, that gives me that momentum that propels me into the sweet spot.
Yeah, that's so true. I've been learning Italian for the last 10 years, so I completely understand that whole process. It's and the other thing that's interesting, I think, too, is that once you break those streaks, it becomes hard. And just this is true in creativity in general. Like, getting back on that cycle is often hard. Like, to get back on and start a new streak, that to me is, I think, something that people struggle with. I don't know if you have any thoughts on how to.
Well, I have two thoughts. Is that's part of the reason why you want to keep them so small, so that you don't break them. But and then if you do, you're deliberate about it. But then the other thing too is this is where grace comes in, of just forgiving yourself. Oh, because usually the challenge is sometimes we get out of the habit, but oftentimes we start to feel bad about ourselves because we broke the streak, and just say, you know what, I forgot to do it yesterday, and I'm sad about that, and I'm disappointed. But this goes back to your why. But I really want to write. So I'm going to get back, and I'm going to keep going, and I'm going to get back on that S curve and keep moving up it.
So you talk about failure a lot in this book, actually.
Yeah.
And some of the failures are really significant. And in one case, there was actually a literal shipwreck in the book, which I just thought was interesting. Like, you didn't actually need to use a metaphor. It happened. Yeah. So how do you think about failure when it comes to growth? So
failure is something that I have really wrestled with. And if you actually read I have 4 books, but like, if you go from Disrupt Yourself to Build an A Team to Smart Growth, you'll see my own journey, and my relationship with failure has shifted over time. What I would say, I remember having a conversation with Alan Mulally a few years ago, and he was formerly the CEO of Ford and of Boeing commercial airplanes. And I said, so Alan, tell me how you think about failure. And he said to me, I don't. And when he said it to me, I'm like, it literally did not compute. So I asked him the question again, and he said, Whitney, I don't. So I asked him the question again, and finally, he was very patient. He said, I don't think of it like that. I don't process when something doesn't work as a failure. He said, I process it as data. I process it as information that will allow me to get better. And so as I started to really parse through this, and I thought about, so what experience am I having, and what experience are most of us having when something doesn't work, is I realized it's not so much that something didn't work, because the reality is that something doesn't work all day long every day. And you think about like a 2-year-old learning how to walk. I mean, it's just not working, but they just keep going. I realized, oh, it's shame. It's shame that limits disruption. It's not failure. Thank you, Brene Brown, for opening up that conversation. And so when you look at something and you say, okay, well, what's going on here? If you're not making progress, there's oftentimes some shame that you're attaching to it. Again, that is it. That is an invitation. It's saying, pay attention to me. You've got some work here, because it's not, you jettison the shame, you can iterate a lot faster and make progress. But here's the beauty of it. Oftentimes when there's an experience of shame, if you can do that work, you're going to find some gold. And here's why. Let me tell you a quick story. I was having a conversation a few years ago with a fellow by the name of Prakash Raman, and he was working at LinkedIn, and he was telling me about his career and all that he'd done. And I was like, wow, this is really interesting. Well, later, a few weeks later, I talked to someone else, and they're like, did you know that Prakash is a great tennis player? And I was like, no, he didn't say anything about it. I find out even more that when he was in high school, he was like top 10 in the United States. I'm like, we're not a good tennis player. Like, he was a great tennis player. So I'm like, Prakash, why didn't you tell me that? Why is that not on your LinkedIn profile anywhere? And then here's what he said: because I was ashamed, because I was embarrassed. Why are you embarrassed? Because I didn't go pro.
Oh, wow.
So here's the beauty of this. Here's the beauty. Where there's shame, now I'm not talking about abuse, it's different. Talking about an experience that you've had, that you've packaged this as there's some referendum on you. What that usually means is there's a story that you're telling yourself about something that was important to you. If you can reframe it, then it becomes a superpower. It becomes who you are. And so for any of you who are listening and thinking about a failure that's very difficult for you to talk about, I want you to consider the fact that there's some gold there for you, for your development, and storytelling that you may at some point be able to tell that will break open your own personal narrative and break open narratives for people around you. So as I said to him, it's the shame, it's always the shame. But when you can ditch that, then you iterate and you learn. And failure is just learning. So you can make more progress.
Yeah, it's really true. We've got a question from one of the attendees. Do you consider it advisable to take on 2 S-curves simultaneously while pursuing something professional, say being an SEO specialist and a web developer, or do you advise taking on 1 S-curve at a time? And can you try contrasting with various S-curves or study subjects like we took in high school?
Love that. That is a great question. So here's my answer to you. If you look at project management, they will tell you, our project managers will tell you that you really shouldn't manage more than 3 or 4 projects at a time. Like that, your productivity starts to drop. We also know from a neuroscience perspective that we really can't process more than 2 to 4 ideas at a time. At the same time, your life, and we talked about these multiple S-curves, it is a portfolio of S-curves. Also, by the way, your team and your company is a portfolio of S-curves as well. But for right now, we're talking about just you. So your life is a portfolio of S-curves. We also know from our research that if you're thinking about it as a portfolio, you want to have standard bell curve distribution. Most of your S-curves in the sweet spot. So 2 of your S-curves in the sweet spot, 1 S-curve at the launch point, and 1 S-curve in mastery. So for example, if you're saying, I want to become an SEO specialist and you're spending a lot of time and a lot of energy on that, great, spend the time on that, but make sure that there are other parts of your life where you're in the sweet spot and even someplace where you're in mastery, so you're anchoring yourself. And this is why you don't want to, for example, move to a new city, start a new job, start taking care of aging parents all at the same time. So if you can at any given time have something that's really anchoring you, that you're an expert in, and you derive pleasure from being an expert, places where you're in the sweet spot where you know enough but not too much. And then at any given time, you also want to have something that you don't do very well, because that's going to allow you to continue to grow and develop.
We have, I think, another question here. Looking to focus on personal branding on LinkedIn for CXOs. Is that a good niche to be in? Any advice on how to approach this offering better?
Okay, so I'm not an expert on CXOs. What I will say, what I am an expert on is that two things. Number one is that when from a theory of just personal disruption, we have 7 accelerants, and you can go back and listen to podcasts. It's a Disrupt Yourself podcast, episode 120, where I talk about playing to your distinctive strengths. And so as you're thinking about positioning yourself, I want you to do 2 things. Number one is look at what are all the things that you do uniquely well that would make you an unusual CXO. So there's some table stakes, but then what's going to differentiate you? Like, for example, every CXO has this background, but you, by the way, have a finance background. Well, how will a finance background make you a hugely unusual CXO? The second thing that I would say to you, and this applies to everybody who's listening, whenever you want to do something new, whenever you want to make any kind of S-curve leap, you are disrupting yourself. But by definition, you are asking the people who you want to hire you to disrupt themselves too. You want to jump to a new S-curve, you're asking them to jump to a new S-curve. So how do you pack a parachute for them? If you've come from finance, you want to be a CXO, you have to learn their language, whether it's Italian or Korean or CXO language. How do you talk about your work in their language so that they can understand you? How do you pack a parachute so that they won't be afraid to jump, to take that risk on you, because you were asking them to jump to a new curve? You pack a parachute so that it feels safe, so that it feels comfortable, so that it feels like it's worthwhile to jump to that new S-curve by hiring you to be the CXO.
So I have one more question for you.
All right.
So at the end of your book, you say that we're responsible for making our own life decisions, but that we achieve very little by ourselves. And so can you talk more about how we as individuals need to rely on this larger ecosystem in order to kind of traverse those stages of growth?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that as I think about, so I use this metaphor of, you want to know where you are on the S-curve mountain, and you've got these different accelerants like playing to your strengths that help you put them in your backpack. But then you're also looking at the weather patterns. Do you have an environment where, there's resilience, where you feel connected to the people around you and what you're doing, so you're all moving up that mountain together? Are those weather patterns working? And that's basically your ecosystem. And so as you're thinking about your own growth, you want an ecosystem that will allow you to grow. But here's what I want you to consider. You also are the ecosystem for people around you. You also, just as you have a manager who's the keystone species, which keystone species means without whom nothing can grow, you are the keystone species for the people around you. And I want you just to reflect on that for a moment. Who around you, without you, they can't grow. If you have children, in your case, your cats, like Merlin and Nero, they need you, Crystal. And I don't mean to be cheeky, but it's true. Like, they need you. Your children, if you've got aging parents, your colleagues, your coworkers, who are you the keystone species for? Who are you the ecosystem for? So this idea of you need to move up the S-curve, but you can't do it alone. And let me tell you one quick story to wrap this up. So there's a wonderful person that I profile in the book. Her name is Astrid Tuminez, and she grew up in the slums of the Philippines. Her family, hut, stilts on the sea. They were in poverty. Her father made $50 a month and they had 7 children. Well, today this person today is the president of a 40,000 person university here in the United States. Now, some of us might say she's a self-made woman. And she would say to you, anybody who believes that they are self-made, who has done this in a vacuum, is absolutely delusional. Why? Because she got where she is because she had an older sister who made sure she was fed when her mother was absent. She had nuns who discovered her, plucked her out of that place, put her in school. She had people who sponsored her to get to the United States. She had a college professor and then work mentors who took a bet on her over and over and over again. So you have to do it by yourself. You must do the work. You are made to act and not be acted upon. You are agentic. That is what this S-curve is about. But you do not do it alone. And remember that the people around you cannot do it alone, and they rely on you to move up that S-curve. So that's what I meant by the ecosystem.
Wow. I feel like my brain is just like almost overload on all of the exciting things that we've talked about today. It's just given me so much food for thought. And I know that from the comments that I've seen in the chat that people have been really very excited about all of the things that you're talking about with this S-curve. And you've really broken it out in such a way that it seems doable and manageable and inspirational. So thank you for joining us today. And I'm going to be sending this link out to the recording, most of the recording, except for the first few minutes, unfortunately. User error on my part. But I will be sending that out. So you can be looking for that in a follow-up email. And thank you again, Whitney, for joining us. And I'm going to share my screen again really quickly, because if you want to reach out to Whitney, I want you to be able to see how you can do that. Here's the website for Whitney, her Twitter, and her LinkedIn.
Thank you, Crystal. And thank you for speaking of ecosystems, thank you for creating a space where we could have a wonderful conversation. And thank you to all of you for your fantastic comments and participation. You made it a lot more fun and enjoyable.
All right. Thanks again. And everyone, I hope you have a great rest of your day or your evening if you're dialing in from somewhere far away.
Take care.
Thanks.